As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're sitting by a softly glowing lamp, your room quiet except for the hum of the night. Or perhaps you're watching distant lights fade through a window, letting yourself drift into the slow rhythm of another time. Wherever you are, take a breath. This story begins long before our calendars. In a world of cold seas, flickering hearths, and restless hearts. If you close your eyes for a moment, imagine the northern world as it once was. The crash of waves along rocky fjords, the dense scent of pine forests soaked in mist, the sharp, salt-heavy air of dawn rolling off the North Sea. The year might be 750, perhaps earlier. The long winters stretch endlessly, and men and women huddle in timber halls, listening to the low murmur of skalds, the storytellers, who speak of gods and ancestors, fate and glory. Outside, the wind howls like a living thing. Inside, a culture is forming, fierce, independent, and drawn always toward the horizon. When we speak of Vikings, we often imagine the familiar. The horned helmets that history never actually gave them, the dragon-proud ships cutting across dark water, the image of an unstoppable raider descending upon the peaceful coasts of Britain or Francia. But the truth, as it so often does, holds more texture, more contradiction, more beauty and sorrow than legend allows. Tonight, we'll follow the true arc of this story, from the roots of Norse society, through its golden age, to its fading twilight under the march of Christendom and kings. It began, as all human stories begin, not with conquest but with survival. Scandinavia, the great northern peninsula, was both beautiful and brutal. From the craggy coastlines of Norway to the quiet forests of Sweden and the islands of Denmark, the land shaped its people. The soil was thin, the winters long, and the sea both generous and unforgiving. To live here required resilience, a deep sense of kinship, and a readiness to adapt. In such a place, the boundaries between life and death, gods and men, were thin, porous, shifting like the mist between valleys. And so, the Norse imagined their universe accordingly. Vast, interwoven, cyclical. The world tree, Yggdrasil, stretched between realms, from the shining halls of Asgard to the shadows of Helheim. Their gods were not distant arbiters of morality, but reflections of life's contradictions. Proud Odin, the wanderer and seeker of knowledge. Brave Thor, protector and stormbringer. Cunning Loki, the trickster who both creates and destroys. These myths were not just stories. They were maps, a way of locating meaning within an unpredictable world. But beneath the mythology beat the pulse of real people. Farmers, traders, poets, warriors. Before they became Vikings, they were Norse, a patchwork of tribes living in scattered settlements, bound by custom and blood rather than empire. They spoke Old Norse, a lyrical, strong language shaped by the rhythm of the sea and the silence of long winters. Their society was tight-knit yet fluid, built upon loyalty, to family, to chieftains, to the web of honor and obligation that defined social life. Then, something began to stir. A restlessness. By the late 8th century, this northern world was poised for transformation. Population growth strained the limited farmland. Trade routes began weaving through the Baltic. Ships, once simple fishing craft, became sleek longships, marvels of engineering able to skim across waves or glide silently up rivers. A generation of young men looked outward and saw opportunity. Across the North Sea, across the horizon. Gold, land, fame, revenge. So many reasons, yet all anchored in a single truth. Their world was expanding. It's from this tension, isolation giving way to motion, that the Viking Age was born. The moment historians mark as its spark came in the summer of 793 AD. Monks at Lindisfarne, an island off the northeast coast of England, were finishing their prayers when the sea delivered a nightmare. Longships appeared against the gray sky, their sails swelling like the wings of dark birds. The monastery was sacked, its treasures stolen, and many of its inhabitants killed or enslaved. To the Christian chroniclers who recorded it, this was no mere raid. It was an apocalypse, a sign of divine anger. In their trembling hands, they wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain." But to the Norse, it was not terror. It was a beginning, The Lindisfarne Raid was not a random act of savagery, but the first recorded step in what would become more than 2 centuries of exploration, trade, settlement, and conquest. A tide that carried Nordic seafarers from Greenland to Baghdad, from the rivers of Ukraine to the coasts of North America. Out of that single summer day emerged an epic, the Viking Age, stretching roughly from 793 to 1066, 3 centuries that reshaped Europe and forever marked the imagination of history. Yet, the Viking story is not just one of expansion. It is one of paradox. The same hands that torched monasteries also built towns, forged trade routes, and laid the foundations of kingdoms. The same culture that prized the fearless warrior also elevated the poet, the skald, whose verses turned fleeting deeds into immortal memory. In Viking society, to live well was to face life's impermanence with courage, to leave behind a name that others would speak when you were gone. As one old poem from the Havamal reminds us, cattle die, kinsmen die, and one day you too shall die, but the fame of deeds never dies. And so, in the candlelit dark, you can almost imagine those words echoing through timber halls, the young listening with quiet awe, the old nodding in remembrance. The Norse world, at its heart, was a tapestry of such stories, half myth, half memory, stitched together by those who refused to yield to the cold. As we journey through this history together, we will move beyond the surface of raiders and kings to meet the people behind those names. We will travel through frozen fjords and smoky hearths, into the hearts of poets and the minds of women who held entire households while their husbands sailed to foreign lands. We'll learn what shaped the Viking soul, and why, even today, its fire has never quite faded. This is not just a story. If we wish to truly understand how the Vikings came to be, their raids, their courage, their yearning for distant shores, we must go back before the sails, before the legends. We must return to the bones of their homeland and the roots of their spirit. Because the Viking Age did not suddenly begin with the thundering of oars on open water. It began quietly, through centuries of endurance shaped by cold, stone, and scarcity. Picture the map of Scandinavia thousands of years before those famed longships ever carved the sea. Ice receded, leaving behind jagged mountains and glacial valleys, dense forests stretching toward a horizon that barely knew the sun in winter. Small bands of settlers moved through this landscape, hunting, fishing, coaxing what little they could from stubborn soil. Over time, these scattered communities became something more than survivors. They became shapers of the North. By the time we reach the centuries before the Viking Age, roughly 500 to 750 AD, the Norse lands were divided into countless small tribal regions. Norway's deep fjords cut the country into narrow, isolated valleys where each group was a world unto itself. Sweden spread wide with forests and lakes, its people turning early toward trade along the Baltic. Denmark, smaller but fertile, was the crossroads, a bridge between the North and continental Europe. 3 lands, 3 temperaments, all bound by the same quiet determination to thrive where the earth gave nothing freely. Life here was organized around the clan, or ett, a network of families linked by blood, loyalty, and shared hardship. In a world where law was memory and justice was personal, your kin were your shield and your story. Every insult or injury could ripple outward, binding generations in cycles of honor and vengeance. There was no centralized kingdom, no unified nation. Power existed in fragments, chieftains, jarls, ruling through reputation more than decree, their influence anchored by the strength of their followers and the wealth they could distribute. We can imagine these early Norse homesteads. Longhouses built from timber and turf, their roofs low and heavy against the wind, smoke rising from the central hearth, the smell of fish drying above the fire, the bleating of sheep outside in the cold dawn, children learning to carve handles from bone while elders recited verses passed down through countless winters. These weren't people of written histories. They were keepers of spoken memory. Story was their lineage, their way of remembering the world. One can almost hear the skalds, those early poets, chanting beneath the rafters. Their verses told of creation, of gods and giants clashing in the void before time, of Ymir, the frost giant whose body formed the earth itself. These stories laid the spiritual foundation for an entire civilization. The myths were not escapism, they were explanations, attempts to make sense of the unpredictable rhythm of survival. When thunder rolled through the valleys, they heard the hammer of Thor. When the northern lights shimmered, they saw the armor of the gods reflected across the heavens. From this faith and landscape grew a particular kind of culture, pragmatic yet mystical, fierce yet deeply poetic. Even the most practical Norse farmer saw life as a contest between forces, light and dark, fortune and fate, season and hunger. The gods themselves fought not to conquer death, but to meet it with courage. That was the moral spine of Norse identity long before anyone heard the name Viking. To live well was not to defeat death. It was to look it in the face, unflinching. Still, the North was not an isolated dreamland. By the 6th and 7th centuries, winds of change from the wider world reached its shores. Traders from the Frankish kingdoms in the south and the Slavs in the east carried goods, news, and, perhaps most dangerously, ideas. Iron tools improved, craftsmanship flourished. Town-like trading settlements began to appear along the coasts, precursors to later hubs such as Ribe in Denmark and Birka in Sweden. Here, northern furs and amber were exchanged for silk, glass, and silver. Step by step, the Norse world began awakening to a broader economy. As wealth trickled in, hierarchies emerged. The once equal farmers started to measure status by how much land and livestock they owned, how many ships their kin could man, and how daring their ventures at sea. Chieftains became more than local leaders. They became symbols of expansion, of ambition. With every successful trade expedition, a myth grew that beyond the horizon lay endless opportunity. But this foundation was also fragile. Scandinavia remained a land of narrow valleys and competing clans. Food ran short. Inheritance laws fragmented farms until sons had little left to inherit. Ambition and frustration became inseparable companions. For young men of spirit, the choice was stark. Accept their lot in a crowded homeland or carve out fortune abroad. It's no coincidence that the earliest Viking expeditions came from Norway and Denmark, where the balance between necessity and adventure tipped most dramatically. Yet during these centuries before the first recorded raids, what truly took root was less a desire for conquest than a habit of movement. Norse communities were already navigators. They fished far out to sea, traded between settlements, and occasionally journeyed into the Baltic in search of iron or pelts. The art of shipbuilding advanced quietly alongside this maritime instinct. First came the simple plank boats, then the elegant clinker-built vessels, light, flexible, and fast. Long before those ships became tools of war, they were instruments of connection. And then there were the stories, the old legends that told of heroes setting out to win glory far from home. These sagas may have been mythic, but they planted a cultural seed. The belief that one could win not just subsistence but immortality through boldness. It was this psychological foundation, built layer by layer from the Iron Age onward, that prepared the Norse for the explosive centuries to come. So, when we speak of Viking origins, we aren't speaking merely of genealogies or territories. We're speaking of a worldview, one born from hardship and myth, isolation and imagination. The Viking Age didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the flowering of an older root system that had been growing for hundreds of years in the thin, frost-bound soil of the north. The men and women who would one day board longships were descendants of those who mastered the art of surviving when the earth itself seemed indifferent. Their courage was not spontaneous. It was inherited, taught, lived every day in the act of enduring. And so the foundation of Viking civilization was not conquest but resilience. It was the quiet knowledge that whatever waited beyond the horizon, it was better to sail toward it than to stand still and starve. In the next chapter, we'll watch as this foundation transforms. We'll see how from scattered clans arose a society capable of reaching across continents, how ordinary farmers became explorers, poets, and kings. Let's imagine ourselves once more in that northern twilight, where the horizon lingers between day and night, and the wind carries salt from the sea and the faint sound of hammers from a distant forge. The world of the early Norse is no longer isolated. Its people are stirring. Within the valleys, fjords, and coastal villages, something new is forming. The framework of a society about to step into legend. By the early 700s, the scattered families and petty chieftains of Scandinavia were beginning to shape a more structured world. The great question of that time wasn't how to conquer, but how to coexist. With every generation, the Norse learned the art of balance, between freedom and order, between fury and law, between the individual's strength and the community's bond. We often imagine Vikings as lawless raiders, men who lived by their swords and died by their oaths. But this is only one side of the blade. Long before their first raids struck Europe, the Norse people had developed a remarkably sophisticated system of governance, built not on empires or monarchs, but on assembly and consensus. Across the land, free men gathered at open-air councils called things, local parliaments where disputes were settled, trade regulations agreed upon, and alliances forged. The thing was more than a court. It was the heartbeat of Norse democracy. Beneath the birch trees or beside the sea, people debated quarrels over land, inheritance, and accusations of dishonor. Everyone had the right to speak, though, in truth, wealth and lineage still carried weight. There were no kings yet, only leaders who ruled by persuasion and reputation. Power was not inherited automatically. It was earned, defended, and sometimes wrestled away. This political rhythm mirrored the rhythm of the land itself. Flexible, improvisational, resilient. Such systems could survive epidemics, famine, even feuds because decisions weren't locked in the hands of one ruler. Authority didn't descend from divine right. It rose from the will of the people. In that sense, the Norse social code was pragmatic yet deeply spiritual. They believed fate was inescapable, yes, but they also believed every person shaped their path through action. Beneath the laws lay the foundation of an honor culture, drengskaper, a word rich with meaning. To be a drenger was to embody courage, fairness, generosity, and loyalty. It wasn't about bloodline or wealth. It was about how you carried yourself when others watched. And when they didn't, a person could lose everything. Their home, their kin, their life, but never their honor. That was sacred. Women, too, held a powerful place within this early social fabric, more so than in many other parts of medieval Europe. Though the world was patriarchal, Norse women wielded real influence. They managed farms, oversaw trade, arranged alliances, and held the keys, literally, to their households. In an age of constant movement, when men left for trade or war, it was the women who kept the rhythm of survival beating. The sagas would later speak of shield maidens, fierce women who took up arms. But even among the ordinary, dignity and autonomy were central to daily life. Economically, the Norse world was transforming. What began as subsistence farming was becoming a mixed economy of agriculture, trade, and craft. The people raised livestock, grew hardy grains, and supplemented their diet with fishing and hunting. But their greatest wealth still came from what lay beyond their shores: fur, ivory, amber, iron, and, most importantly, mobility. Every resource of the land was finite, but the sea stretched infinite before them. As trading settlements like Ribe in Denmark and Birka in Sweden grew, so too did networks of exchange. By the mid-8th century, Scandinavian merchants were already sailing into the markets of Frisia and through the Baltic to the lands of the Slavs and Finns. They encountered coins stamped with Arabic script from the Caliphate, silver that would soon flood Norse society and transform its economy. These coins weren't just currency. They were symbols of connection. Each one told of a wider world the Vikings were learning to navigate, barter by barter, voyage by voyage. Religion, or perhaps more precisely belief, continued to give meaning to all these transformations. The Norse pantheon was vast, a constellation of gods and goddesses who reflected every aspect of human life. There were the war gods, Odin and Tyr, the gods of fertility and prosperity, Freyr and Freya, and those of mischief and change, like Loki. But the divine was never aloof. It was woven into nature. A stone could be sacred, a tree inhabited by a spirit, a distant rumble of thunder, a message from Thor himself. Rituals were intimate affairs, conducted in sacred groves or near household altars. Sacrifices, animals, sometimes valuables, were made not just to win favor, but to maintain balance between the seen and unseen. Life and death, gain and loss, all were reciprocal. The Norse world wasn't ruled by fear of punishment in an afterlife. It was ruled by the understanding that every deed echoed, seen or unseen, through the web of existence known as WYRD fate. And yet, beneath this harmony, tension stirred. Ambition began to ripple through clan alliances. Those who commanded ships and gathered wealth began to draw followers bound by loyalty rather than blood. Slowly, power was concentrating. Chieftains who could protect trade routes or lead raiding bands gained prestige. In Norway's narrow valleys, strong leaders emerged from families like the Ynglings of Vestfold. In Denmark, ambitious rulers began to unify tribes under a single banner. At this stage, however, these were still fragile unions. The Norse world prized freedom too deeply to submit easily to centralized rule. A man's worth was measured by self-reliance. Too much power in one hand felt like theft to another. Thus, the early development of Viking society was a constant negotiation between the longing for unity and the instinct for independence. Meanwhile, technology quietly advanced. Norse craftsmen were inventing tools that would redefine mobility. Their shipwrights perfected the clinker technique, overlapping planks that made hulls both strong and elastic, capable of handling rough seas and shallow rivers alike. Each ship was a masterpiece of balance. Elegant, light, deadly fast. Even now, centuries later, the sight of a recovered longship, its skeletal frame displayed in museums, feels almost alive, as if ready to wake at the touch of salt water. And ships, of course, meant more than transport. They became symbols, extensions of identity. A chieftain's vessel was as much a declaration of power as his hall or his sword. To own a ship was to possess freedom. To sail was to prove one's worth. By the late 8th century, this framework, social, economic, spiritual, and technological, was converging into a single historical force. The Norse were becoming not just a people of survival, but a people of momentum. Their societies were stable enough to support innovation, yet restless enough to crave risk. Their leaders had learned to command men, and their men had learned to follow. Their myths told them that every fate was written, and so, paradoxically, they sought to write their own. In that crucible of cold seas and stubborn dreams, the stage was set for what would come next. The moment when the North would reach out and seize the world's attention. Next, we'll witness that transformation fully take shape, how authority solidified, how identity crystallized, and how the scattered Norse lands began to pulse with one name: Viking. The North had always been a place of fragments. Isolated valleys, lonely farms, fierce families separated by forests and fjords. But as the 8th century drew toward its close, those fragments began, slowly, to knit together. Out of the clamor of feud and trade, a new kind of order took shape, not the heavy rule of empires, but the beginnings of something distinct, the forging of a people who would soon be known to the world as Vikings. Picture a small harbor in western Norway, a crescent of stone framed by dark pine hills and restless sea. Ships of a local chieftain rest on the shore, their wooden hulls still slick with last night's rain. Men unload barrels of dried fish and fox pelts from a newly returned voyage. A woman tallies the goods. Her woven cloak gleams faintly in the low light. This too is power, quiet, transactional, communal. But above it all stands a man whose hall faces the fjord. He is Jarl Lord, not by divine right, but by strength, alliances, and the trust of those around him. Over time, the influence of such men extended beyond bays and valleys. And when power stretches, structure must follow. That structure began not with kings, but with loyalty. A chieftain maintained his rule by the generosity of gift-giving, a sacred social glue. Gold arm rings, weapons of fine steel, ornate brooches. These were not mere symbols of vanity. They were tokens of belonging, exchanged with ceremony, binding a leader to his followers. To receive a gift was also to give one's word, to fight when called upon, to uphold honor, to settle debts in loyalty or blood. Thus, power in the early Norse world was not kept by force, but constantly renewed through mutual obligation. At the heart of this system was the herd, a lord's household retinue, his hand-picked circle of warriors, advisors, and trusted kin. The herdmen swore oaths to defend their jarl and uphold his renown, their relationship defined as much by closeness as by hierarchy. It was a living embodiment of Norse society itself, equal parts family and institution, uniting independence with allegiance. Over time, these herds became the blueprint for organized militaries and even courts that later rulers would institutionalize. But leadership in this age meant more than military command. The jarls were judges, mediators, and hosts. Their wealth came from the sea and the loyalty of their communities, from successful raids, trade ventures, and control of key harbors. As certain families grew richer, their authority began to formalize. By the 9th century, dynasties were taking shape. The Fairhair clan in Norway, the Silding descendants in Denmark, the Svir kings around Lake Mälaren in Sweden. With each passing decade, law became as valued as the sword. The Norse codified their traditions orally through law speakers, elders with prodigious memory who served as living libraries of justice. They recited the laws aloud at each thing, where they were debated and reaffirmed by the community. There was no parchment, no royal edict, only memory, rhythm, repetition. It was law alive in sound. While Christian Europe bound its decrees in ink, the Norse bound theirs in speech, flexible, adaptive, responsive to circumstance. Yet even as internal systems grew stronger, external contact intensified. Raiding, what began as opportunistic strikes along foreign shores, was evolving into organized campaigns. Jarls who commanded skillful crews soon realized that raids were as much political tools as they were economic ones. A successful attack enriched not just the raiders, but their homeland networks, strengthening the power of ambitious leaders. Gradually, wealth from abroad began to circulate through Scandinavian society. Silver coins, foreign dyes, fine glassware. The North, once marginal, was being woven into Europe's bloodstream. And from that wealth, identity took shape. By 830, the word Viking had already begun appearing in written sources, a term not of nationality, but of occupation and spirit. To go Viking, fara I Viking, was to set out on an expedition, to leave the stability of land for the risks of sea. It was a vocation, a calling, sometimes even an escape. For many young men with little inheritance, it was also the only route to status. Not every Norseman was a Viking, but every Viking shared that hunger for motion, for destiny. Unified symbols began emerging across the northern lands. Distinct art styles, intricate knots, swirling beasts, serpentine motifs, began to adorn wood, stone, and metalwork. Runestones, once markers of memory, grew more numerous and ornate, inscribing names of the fallen beside symbols of Thor or Odin. Art and writing became tools of permanence, echoing the very Norse desire to defy time. Let this stone stand in memory of. Such phrases appear again and again, as if the living could speak eternity into being. Ships, too, became declarations of belonging. They were not identical across Scandinavia but shared unmistakable features. Overlapping planks, curved prows, symmetrical design. Recognizable signatures of a single seafaring culture. It's here, in the Longships silhouette, that Norse identity crystallized. Those who saw its dragon head rising over the tide in foreign lands knew at once. The North had arrived. Religion also began to formalize during this consolidation. What had been intimate household rituals grew into organized seasonal festivals. The blot ceremonies, where entire communities gathered to feast, sacrifice, and reaffirm bonds with the divine. The worship of Odin and Thor became not only personal but communal, binding separate tribes under shared faith. The gods of poetry, war, and fertility mirrored the expanding scope of Norse life, from survival to dominance. The North's growing confidence even reshaped its sense of fate. Earlier generations saw destiny as fixed, what was woven by now, the North was no longer whispering. It was singing. The song of the Viking Age echoed across oceans, a deep-throated rhythm of oars striking waves, of iron meeting shield, of laughter mingling with storm. The restless sons and daughters of Scandinavia had burst beyond their home fjords, their sails catching winds that carried them into legend. It was the 8th and 9th centuries, the age of expansion, of flourishing, when warriors, traders, farmers, poets, and settlers reshaped both their world and the world beyond. Let's stand for a moment on the cliffs of western Norway around the year 850. Before us lies a coastline punctured by inlets, the sea shimmering beneath a low gray sky. Below, dozens of ships gather near the mouth of the fjord, slender longships and broader nars heavy with trade goods. The water smells of salt and tar and pine. Voices rise from the shore, men loading supplies, women calling farewells, the clang of tools echoing against the hillsides. It isn't chaos, but choreography. The North has become mobile. The Viking Age is fully alive. The geography of ambition. Across Scandinavia, prosperity was reshaping daily life. In Denmark, where the land was fertile and strategic, sprawling market towns like Ribe and Hedeby thrived. These were bustling commercial centers where Norse merchants met Frisians, Saxons, and Slavs. You could walk through a single street and hear half a dozen languages, smell fish, pitch, and exotic spices all mingling together. Silver coins flowed like blood through this artery of trade, connecting the icy north with warm, distant deserts through unseen hands. Further east, on Sweden's misty coasts, seafarers moved along the great river systems of present-day Russia and Ukraine. The Varangians, as the Eastern Vikings came to be known, pushed deep into the Slavic lands, following the Fokhof and Dnieper rivers. They traded furs, honey, and slaves for silk and silver, forging trade routes that reached all the way to Constantinople and Baghdad. The Norse were no longer fringe explorers, they were global intermediaries bridging civilizations. And to the west, the Danes and Norwegians carved their own paths. They raided, but they also settled. The coastlands of Ireland, the Isles of Scotland, parts of northern England, these became homes, not just battlegrounds. Dublin itself, the modern Irish capital, was founded as a Viking trading post, Dyflin, around 841. York, too, then Jorvik, thrived under Norse control, a place where silver workers, merchants, and poets crowded its narrow wooden streets. Life in the north, but even as Norsemen shaped distant shores, life at home flourished. Farming remained the root of everything. Fields of barley and rye, herds of sheep and goats, smoke coiling up from longhouses where families warmed themselves through endless northern nights. The craftsmanship of the period reveals a society rich not just in wealth but in artistry. Brooches, sword hilts, combs, and even ship nails were adorned with delicate engravings, spirals, beasts, and interlocking lines that seemed to flow like rivers. Beauty was in everything, even instruments of war. The longhouse remained the nucleus of life. Inside its smoky warmth, stories were currency. Skalds, poets, chroniclers, mythmakers, moved from hall to hall, carrying history in their voices. Their songs praised chieftains, mocked fools, and immortalized heroes. In an oral culture, poetry was power, a way to cheat death. Even ordinary people valued the rhythm of words. To speak well was to wield influence. A clever tongue was sometimes sharper than an axe. A quality, that fragile treasure of Norse culture, still pulsated beneath the surface. Though a chieftain might grow rich from raids, his authority depended on respect. The Thing assemblies continued to regulate society, maintaining a democratic temper even amid growing hierarchy. Decisions still required consensus. Disputes still found settlement before gathered crowds. It was a society aware of its complexity, trying always to balance freedom with order. The elegance of the sea. It was in this age that the Norse achieved some of their finest technological feats, their ships, masterpieces of woodcraft and intuition. Each longship was a fusion of form and function. A shallow draft that allowed river navigation, a flexible hull that endured violent seas, and a symmetrical design that could reverse direction without turning. Decorated prows, often carved into dragon heads, were more than decoration. They were spiritual symbols meant to ward off spirits and frighten foes. To sail in such a ship was to feel almost alive inside the pulse of motion. 50 men, rowing in rhythm, guided by the steady hand of a helmsman, and above them, a square sail catching the wind just so. These vessels weren't crude. They were elegant extensions of the human will, tools of exploration as much as tools of conquest. The seafaring instinct extended even further west. From Norway, settlers ventured to the Faroes, then to Iceland, establishing new communities amid volcanic plains and icy rivers. Iceland in particular became a beacon of Norse imagination, a place far removed, yet filled with the old traditions. There, families carved out a civilization shaped by law, poetry, and pride. It would later become the land of Sagas, the memory keepers of the entire Viking spirit. The golden years of exploration. Between 850 and 950, the Vikings reached almost everywhere the sea could take them. They struck into Francia, extracted tribute from English kings, founded the Duchy of Normandy, the land of the Northmen, and even wintered along the Loire. In the east, Swedish adventurers reached Kiev, helping to establish what would become Kievan Rus. To the north, Norwegian explorers like Gunnbjorn Ulfsson glimpsed the icy coasts of Greenland, a sign of the future yet to come. These centuries were the heartbeat of the Viking expansion, a period where every voyage brought both material riches and widening imagination. The Vikings weren't merely raiders or traders. They were cultural translators. They adopted Christian silver, Frankish art styles, and Slavic customs into their own aesthetic language. The Norse world became both exporter and sponge, absorbing and reinventing everything it touched, spirit and values. But for all their outward success, the Norse spirit remained grounded in something ancient, courage before fate. Their gods demanded not obedience but bravery. A man's worth lay in how he faced his destiny. Defeat wasn't failure, cowardice was. Even as wealth grew, the old ideal, the pursuit of honor, still anchored their moral universe. To live was to accept impermanence. Stones crumbled, wood rotted, bodies fell. Only names endured, carried in song. This philosophy of fleeting glory infused Norse life with an intensity that feels almost modern. They labored, feasted, hunted, loved, all with the knowledge that time would take everything except how they faced it. So this age, the flourishing century of the Viking world, was not simply about wealth or conquest. It was about expression. The Norse left marks across Europe not just in fire and gold, but in language, art, and law. They connected worlds that had once been distant. They taught that movement itself could be civilization, that a people defined by horizons could shape history as powerfully as any empire. As the fires from their hearths glowed across fjords and foreign camps alike, the Vikings must have felt unstoppable. Their ships were the arteries of the age, their stories its heartbeat. Yet, as we'll see, even the strongest tide eventually meets the shore. For now, at this apex, when the Norse gods watched proudly from Asgard and the northern seas seemed endless, the Viking dream burned brightest. The golden light of a late northern summer spreads across the fjords, glinting off the sea like shards of bright steel. Beneath that calm, the great machinery of Viking society hums quietly. Trade routes pulse with motion. Ships return laden with goods and tales. In the halls, laws are spoken, disputes settled, alliances shaped. It is the 9th century, the age when the Norse world wasn't only thriving, but functioning, intricate as clockwork, held together by customs older than memory. When people think of the Vikings, they imagine wild energy, raids, voyages, adventure. But what's less often told is the delicate order that made such chaos possible. For raiders to sail, artisans had to forge, farmers had to provide, gods had to be honored, and laws had to hold. Civilization, even one born of wind and salt, rests upon rhythm. So tonight, let's look closer. Imagine standing in a Norse settlement at dawn. Frost still clings to the blades of grass. Smoke curls from the longhouse roofs. The air smells faintly of ash and honeyed mead from last night's feast. Beneath the calm chatter of animals and people, a complex web of duty and purpose connects everyone here. This is how the Viking world actually worked. The social fabric. At the heart of Norse life lay a clear hierarchy, but one defined more by function than by rigid oppression. At the top were the jarls, the chieftains and nobles, men whose wealth derived from land ownership and maritime command. Beneath them were the carls, freemen who made up most of the population, farmers, traders, shipbuilders, craftsmen, and sailors. These were the backbone of Norse civilization, proud of their independence yet bound by allegiance to local lords. Below them, a smaller but significant group, the thralls, enslaved or indebted individuals, often captured in raids or punishment. Thralls worked in households, tended fields, or assisted craftspeople. Still, Norse slavery was not purely static. Thralls could be freed through service or ransom, and freedmen sometimes rose to prominence. Even here, motion was possible, a reflection of the Viking ethos that life was a contest, and fortune a tide. Women's roles, though shaped by patriarchy, carried undeniable weight. A woman could inherit property, manage estates, and demand divorce, rights far beyond those of most European counterparts. She was keeper of keys, arbiter of household affairs, and often guardian of familial honor while men were away. Women's jewelry was more than decoration. It was a declaration of status, heavy brooches that marked not vanity, but power, law and justice. For a culture so famous for its sword, it was astonishingly legalistic. Law, above all, was memory made spoken. The gatherings known as things still met across the land, where every free man could speak and vote. Presiding over each assembly was the law speaker, a man chosen for his vast recall of customary law. Standing atop a large stone or mound, he recited from memory every enactment, every precedent, ensuring the fluid order of the Norse world. Justice was personal, but it wasn't arbitrary. Compensation, known as wergild, literally man price, fixed the value of every wrong. To kill was not always to doom, but to indemnify, depending on context and honor. The aim was equilibrium, not vengeance, though blood feuds still flared when pride outweighed reason. The thing also served political life. Alliances were negotiated, proclamations made, marriages announced. For the Vikings, law itself was ceremony, a ritual binding the living to ancestral rules. No parchment sealed their justice. The voice did. In that, perhaps, lay their genius. A society fluid yet constrained, capable of adapting without collapsing. Economy and craft. The Norse economy was a living network, stretching from Arctic fisheries to the deserts of Arabia. Farmers remained its foundation, tending barley, rye, and livestock, but specialization was blooming. Artisans filled the towns, their forges sparking with craft. Ironworking was ubiquitous. Tools, weapons, hinges, nails, and ornaments emerged from every coastal settlement. Blacksmiths held almost sacred status, transforming soil and fire into both survival and art. Trade was the lifeblood flowing through this body. Goods passed continuously. Walrus ivory from Greenland, furs from Lapland, soapstone, timber, weapons, and slaves. All exchanged for Frankish wine, Irish pottery, silk from Byzantium, or silver from the Caliphate. The Vikings operated on a silver-weight economy. Coins were valued by weight, not mint. Traders traveled with small scales and hacked coins into pieces when exact change was needed, a practice both practical and poetic. In their hands, even silver sung of movement. Markets along major waterways became miniature melting pots. Burka, Kopang, Hedeby, names that meant opportunity. Archaeologists have unearthed Arabic dirhams, Byzantine beads, and even Indian cowrie shells, proof that Viking trade networks spanned astonishing distances. It was not an empire, but it behaved like one, a decentralized oceanic web of interaction and exchange. Belief and ritual. Order, for the Norse, extended into the sacred. Their religion was not centralized. There were no temples like Rome's, no scripture like Christendom's. Faith was woven into land and life. God houses existed, simple wooden structures or sacred groves, but grand rituals often unfolded under open sky. Every season carried its own observances. There were blots, sacrificial feasts, at Yule, spring, and harvest. offerings of animals, ale, and sometimes more precious things, jewelry, ships, lives. The gods were transactional. They gave if given to. To keep their favor was both piety and practicality. Yet Norse spirituality curved always toward fatalism and courage. The great mythic narrative of Ragnarok, the end of all things, wasn't despair, but defiance. It was an acknowledgement that even gods die, yet valor endures in how one meets the inevitable. That belief stitched ethics into their daily lives. Every oath mattered, every promise bound by something eternal. The dead, too, were tended with extraordinary care. Some were buried with full ships, others with weapons, jewelry, even animals, tools for the next world. Viking graves, far from mere displays of wealth, were declarations of identity and memory. Death was not the end of meaning. It was continuity. The ancestors formed part of the living order, their presence felt in every hall where songs were sung. Infrastructure of community. The Norse weren't city builders. They were connectors. Their infrastructure existed along rivers and coasts, points of contact where ship meets shore, where one culture merges into another. Settlements clustered around harbors. A typical village might contain a few dozen households, a longhouse at its heart, workshops nearby, stables, and communal spaces for gatherings. Even architecture reflected communal thinking. The longhouse, long, narrow, timbered, smoky, symbolized unity. Extended families slept, ate, and worked under one roof. It was both fortress and cradle, built to flex beneath wind and snow, to breathe with weather. Fire burned constantly at its center, a silent reminder that warmth was life and cooperation its fuel, holding it all together. In a world without centralized government or bureaucracy, what held Norse society together was honor. That word, echoed endlessly in sagas, formed an invisible architecture of trust. It replaced paperwork, coinage, and kings. Reputation was currency. A trader cheated once might never find buyer again. A warrior who fled lost his name forever. Each act became an inscription upon one's living legend. Thus, every deed mattered. Every voyage soared with both promise and risk, not only for material gain but for immortality through story. The skald stood ready to preserve and judge, translating action into verse. A good death meant one worth remembering. When all these systems, law, trade, faith, and craft, wove together, the Viking world stood at its most harmonious. Scandinavia was not yet one kingdom, nor peaceful, but it was functional, proud, and self-sustaining. This people believed their world made sense, their gods still listening, their ships still invincible. And yet, in that equilibrium lay a shadow, because every order holds within it the seeds of change. As the Norse grew wealthy and powerful, they also grew entangled, politically, economically, spiritually, with powers far beyond their fjords. The tide that had carried them outward would soon begin to pull in unexpected directions. Imagine standing by a harbor in the year 950. The air hums with life. The crackle of forges, the chatter of merchants, the rhythmic splash of oars against still water. The longships are sleeker now, their sails dyed red and gold, their prows curved like creatures from legend. Silver ornaments sparkle on the wrists of traders, and laughter spills from halls where skalds recite songs of distant battles. This is it, the high tide of the Viking Age. The North has risen from its rugged isolation into the sunlight of full civilization. From the fjords of Norway to the plains of Denmark, from the lakes of Sweden to the marketplaces of Ireland and the rivers of Rus, the Norse world pulses like a living organism. Power, wealth, and story flow in every direction. The word Viking no longer belongs to a few daring raiders. It describes a civilization that has touched the edges of the known world. The reach of the North. This was the age when Viking influence stretched wider than any monarch's crown could measure. Scandinavian warriors served as mercenaries in Byzantine palaces, their axes glinting by the marble walls of Constantinople. Norse merchants drank coffee-like brews in eastern markets, haggling with Arab traders for silk and silver. And across the western seas, Viking settlers carved out new realms on foreign shores: Ireland, Scotland, England, Normandy, Iceland, Greenland. In England, much of the north and east had begun to follow its own laws. Danelaw, they called it, a region ruled under Norse customs, where the old runes blended with the Latin alphabet, and even the locals learned to think the Viking way. In Normandy, a Norse chieftain named Rollo had been granted land by the French king in 911, and his descendants would, in a century's time, change European history forever under a name you might know, Normans. To the east, Swedish explorers known as Varangians threaded their way along rivers toward the Black Sea. They established trade posts that grew into cities Novgorod, Kiev, Smolensk. From their ranks came the first rulers of a fledgling state, the Rus. It's strange to think, perhaps, that modern Russia took its very name from northern seafarers. Yet history often hides its roots in faraway tides. The shape of prosperity. At home, towns flourished. Hedeby, on the Danish border, became the busiest marketplace in northern Europe. Its docks crammed with ships, its air filled with shouts in at least 10 languages. Birka, on a lake island near modern Stockholm, glittered like a jewel, a hub of skilled artisans shaping trade goods bound for foreign courts. In Norway, small shipyards dotted every cove, each a workshop of symmetry and speed. Even religion reflected this prosperity. Wooden temples like the one at Uppsala rose grand and ornate, decorated with carved pillars depicting Thor's hammer and Odin's ravens. Blots, festivals of sacrifice, became spectacles of abundance, feasts where mead flowed endlessly, and animals were offered in gratitude for successful harvests or safe returns. Faith remained practical, but its scale had become magnificent. And across this vibrant landscape, poetry and storytelling reached their zenith. Skaldic verse, once raw and tribal, grew elaborate, a complex art of kennings, rhythm, and riddling metaphor. Kings and jarls competed not only in warfare but in eloquence, each seeking to be immortalized in the words of poets whose lines could carry memory for centuries. In these halls, art and power became inseparable, each feeding the other's flame. Daily life at the height. But what was life like for the ordinary Viking during this glittering age? In the countryside, most families still lived as farmers, their existence hard, but their horizons wider than ever. A man might plow his field one year and sail to Dublin the next. Exchange and travel brought new foods, new fashions, new diseases, and new dreams. Linen and silk began replacing rough wool among the wealthy. Glass beads from the east decorated women's tunics. Iron tools became common, making daily labor smoother if never easy. Life was still governed by seasons. Winter remained long and intimate. Nights of firelight, storytelling, and preparation. Spring meant sowing. Summer called men to sea. Autumn was for harvest and reckoning, to weigh the success of voyages and decide who would pay and who would feast. Education, though informal, thrived in the oral tradition. Children learned history through sagas, ethics through poems, and skill through observation. The art of memory was revered. To forget a story was to betray an ancestor. Military power and order. At this pinnacle, war was science as much as courage. Viking fleets could coordinate across hundreds of miles, attacking or trading in patterns that baffled more centralized kingdoms. The same discipline that built ships governed warfare. Flexibility, timing, and instinct. Armies formed shield walls, rows of men interlocking circular shields into a living barrier. Discipline turned men into architecture. Weapons were personal, almost sacred. A sword wasn't merely iron. It was identity. Given names like Legbiter or Wolf-Tongue, they carried their own reputations. But martial valor was balanced by pragmatism. Vikings fought for plunder, revenge, or allegiance, not for ideology. Their wars were human, not holy. Increasingly, ambitious rulers sought more than raids. They wanted dominion. Denmark under Gorm the Old and Harald Bluetooth began taking shape as a unified kingdom. Norway's Harald Fairhair fought to bring dozens of rival jarls under one crown. Sweden saw its own line of kings claim the mantle of divinely sanctioned leadership. What had begun as a network of alliances was hardening into monarchy. The Viking world, for all its chaos, was beginning to dream of states. Faith at its peak. Religion remained vivid, textured, and alive. Temples at Uppsala, Trondheim, and Lydra stood as centers of ritual, where people offered sacrifices for victory, fertility, and peace. The gods were ever present, reflected in art, invoked in oaths. Thor was beloved among common folk, protector and champion. Odin remained the patron of kings and poets, the god of wisdom, but also of sacrifice and the unknown. The runes, thought to be gifts from him, continued to hold sacred power. To carve a rune was not merely to write, it was to call into being. And yet, beyond those northern temples, a new faith was spreading: Christianity. Quietly, persistently. Missionaries arrived from the south, and some jarls, impressed by Christian kings of Europe, began to convert, if only for politics. But that is a tale for another time. For now, the old gods still ruled the skies, their myths as luminous as the northern lights. The illusion of permanence. This was the apogee, the century when everything seemed unshakable. The Longships owned the seas, the laws held firm, the halls glowed with gold and song. The Norse people had turned their marginal, frostbitten homeland into a civilization that reached half the known world. And yet, history always hides its transitions in plain sight. Beneath the order and prosperity, small cracks had already begun to appear. Rivalries between emerging kings, growing inequality, pressure from foreign powers, cultural entanglements that would soon unravel the old balance. But none of that is visible just yet. For now, the Viking stands at the prow of his ship, bronze armoring glinting, watching the world he helped build stretching in every direction. Behind him lies the north, proud and fierce. Ahead, the sun glows over endless water. To his mind, this is forever. Next, we descend gently from this height into the gathering twilight, Part 8. The first cracks, where we begin to see how even the strongest tide can start to ebb. In every great story, there comes a moment when triumph begins to echo strangely, when the songs of glory take on a note of melancholy. The North, in all its power and wealth, had reached this moment. It did not arrive as thunder or catastrophe. It came quietly, like the sound of ice melting. Prosperity had brought stability, yes, but also distance, between ruler and ruled, tradition and ambition, the old gods and the new faiths at their doorstep. It is the late 10th century. The fjords are still busy, the harbors still bustling. But if you linger long enough in the noise of markets or the silence of pine forests, you might hear the faint groan of change. The Viking world is no longer the same as the one born 2 centuries earlier. The first cracks were not visible in the wood of their ships or the iron of their swords, but in their hearts, their loyalties, their need to belong to something larger than the clan or the sea. Ambition turns inward. As the Norse lands prospered, chieftains grew into kings, and kings hungered for kingdoms. What had once been a network of loosely allied jarls began transforming into monarchies. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden, each sought to bind his realm under unified banners. Power, once shared through things and local assemblies, began to consolidate. But the Norse temperament was not easily ruled. Independent farmers who had followed jarls by choice felt uneasy under kings who ruled by decree. In the halls, whispers echoed, of taxes placed, freedoms eroded, laws dictated from above. The same people who had defied empires now found themselves subjects of their own creations. Unity gave strength, but also friction. Kings needed armies. Armies needed silver. Silver came from trade and wars. Yet as Viking raids dwindled in yield and foreign defenders grew wiser, those cycles of wealth faltered. To keep their power, kings began taxing the very freemen whose ancestors had once sailed freely to raid and trade. This quiet inversion, from adventurers to taxpayers, changed the Viking soul more profoundly than battles ever did. The threat of change from beyond. While Scandinavia's inner order strained, winds from the south carried new voices. Missionaries, monks, traders, and kings bearing crosses instead of swords. Christianity had long been pressing against the old religion, sometimes subtly, sometimes by force. At first, the Norse treated it pragmatically. Trade with Christian Europe brought wealth. Alliances with Christian kings brought security. A few rulers adopted the new faith as a political tool, a symbol of diplomacy, not devotion. Harald Bluetooth famously declared Denmark Christian, but his people whispered that Odin still walked their hills. Conversion, however, was a rearrangement not only of belief but of rhythm. Christianity introduced new rituals, written language, written law, and the concept of one God, absolute, singular, foreign to the fluid cosmos of the Norse mind. Where once life was a balance of forces, now it became obedience to doctrine. For many, this shift felt unnatural, even dishonorable. The blots turned quiet, the sacred groves felled. The gods who once answered in wind and thunder seemed to recede into memory. For others, though, this new faith offered something irresistible. Stability and salvation. Promised a world beyond fate, a victory even over death itself. For people long familiar with the cruelty of the sea, this seemed an alluring mercy. Thus, religion began dividing communities, families, and even entire kingdoms. One brother might kneel at a church altar while another raised a hammer carved with Thor's mark for protection. The conflict was rarely open war, more often a slow erosion like waves wearing down stone. Foreign pressures, familiar enemies. The world beyond Scandinavia was changing fast. England, long divided into smaller realms, was uniting under strong monarchs like Alfred and Ethelstan, who learned to resist and even reclaim lands once taken by the Norse. In Francia, once a playground of Viking raids, the new Normandy was ruled by Norse descendants turned Christian dukes. Men who spoke French, commanded fortresses, and rarely looked back toward their northern roots. The old sea routes still existed, but they were crowded now with organized navies, tolls, and laws. The glory days of easy plunder were gone. Raiding, once a rite of passage, became perilous. And as the profit faded, so too did the appetite for it. Internal strife compounded the pressure. Rival kings waged wars not for expansion but for control over their own coastlines. Nobles jockeyed for favor. Families torn between loyalties fled to new settlements. Iceland, Greenland, even Vinland across the Western Ocean. Ambition, once outward, now turned inward. The energy that had built the Viking Age began to feed upon itself. The fragile balance of prosperity. It's often said that wealth tests a society more than poverty. For centuries, hardship had forged Norse unity. Hunger taught fairness. Distance taught cooperation. But prosperity was subtler. Silver brought envy. Titles brought hierarchy. The flexible equality of thing assemblies gave way to royal courts. Aristocracy replaced kinship. Trade, once adventurous, became institutional. As wealth concentrated, so did corruption. Warriors became landlords. Poets became flatterers. The same system that once rewarded boldness now rewarded caution, obedience, inheritance. In the countryside, farmers noticed it first. The taxes, the legal decrees, the subtle shift from belonging to being owned. Some resisted quietly, clinging to the old ways. Others left, setting sail west. The beginning of the end rarely announces itself. It slips in with the ordinary rhythms of life. A treaty signed here, a king baptized there, an old song forgotten as a new one takes its place. So it was with the Vikings. Their decline wasn't a single battle or one enemy's triumph. It was the quiet unraveling of a tapestry they had spent centuries weaving, thread by thread, belief by belief, until the pattern of their world no longer held. It is the late 10th and early 11th centuries now. The longships still glide across the water, but fewer carry warriors. Most are merchant hulks, their decks heavy with goods, their sails weathered by peace instead of war. The Norse haven't vanished. They've adapted. And adaptation, once their greatest survival skill, is slowly reshaping them out of recognition. Kings of a new order. The transformation began at the top. In Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth's Christianity had become law. His son, Sven Forkbeard, and grandson, Nut the Great, carried this new model of kingship even further. No longer were leaders cult figures bound by sacred oaths and honor. They were monarchs with organized armies, treasuries, taxes, and divine sanction. Knut's reign, 1016 to 1035, was, in many ways, the height of Viking political power. He ruled over England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, a North Sea empire linking trade and law across borders. His court in England sparkled with wealth and diplomacy. Poets sang in Old Norse beside priests chanting in Latin. On the surface, it looked like an apotheosis, the ultimate triumph of the Northmen. But something essential had shifted. Where once the Norse world drew strength from its independence, Knut's empire thrived only through submission. Chieftains became administrators. Warriors became tax collectors. The adventurous spirit that had driven men to Greenland and Constantinople narrowed into the paperwork of empire. The Vikings, for the first time, were not just fighting kings. They were becoming kings. And as often happens, when the blood of conquerors turns to the ink of rulers, their fire cools. The loss of the old faith. Faith, too, was changing faster than the land could keep pace. One by one, the North's sacred spaces fell silent. Groves once filled with offerings grew over with moss. Wooden idols were burned, buried, or transformed into crosses. It wasn't always violent. Sometimes the change came through a single generation's weary acceptance. In Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason baptized his country with both persuasion and sword. Olaf the Saint continued his work until his death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, a defeat that paradoxically turned him into a Christian martyr. Churches rose where temples once stood, and runestones began carrying crosses alongside the dragon carvings. For many, it was pragmatic. To trade with Europe required sharing Europe's faith. For others, it was tragedy. The gods of their fathers fading into myth, the world tree Yggdrasil shaken but not yet fallen. Yet even in this transformation, remnants of the old belief persisted. The Norse wove their gods into memory rather than abandoning them. By syncretism or stubborn nostalgia, they recast Odin as a figure of wisdom, Thor as a protector still invoked in oaths, Freya as a saint-like spirit of fertility. In this coexistence, however brief, we glimpse their resilience. The Norse didn't fall to Christianity. They merged with it. Still, the cost was unseen. When a people rewrites its gods, it also rewrites itself. The breaking of old communities. While kings turned their gaze outward, local life began to fray. The traditional balance, the thing assemblies, the egalitarian councils, withered under royal rule. Decisions once made in meadows and marketplaces were now decreed from stone halls. Laws that once lived in voice were copied into Latin script. Order solidified, but the old intimacy vanished. Villages split along lines of class. Wealth clustered around monasteries and royal estates. The once free farmers, the carls, slowly became tenants dependent on land they no longer fully owned. And with that, 1,000 years of Norse social rhythm began to dissolve. At the same time, the economy that had once enriched them now bound them to foreign markets. Silver from the caliphate dried up after trade routes collapsed under new powers. The lucrative raids that had sustained chieftains ended as Europe strengthened its defenses. Viking fleets that had once terrified coastlines now sailed as mercenaries for foreign kings or as merchants paying tolls to their former prey. The hunter had joined the managed world of commerce. Moreover, the very expansion that had made them powerful now stretched them thin. Colonies like Greenland and Vinland demanded constant resupply. Iceland suffered volcanic eruptions and harsh winters that tested endurance. Some settlements faded quietly, their inhabitants lost between history and ice, identity in question. As these transformations deepened, the Norse sense of self began to splinter. Were they still Vikings when they no longer raided? When they knelt in churches instead of groves? When their kings ruled by paper law instead of personal honor? Many must have asked these questions silently, as they toiled on farms or heard mass in foreign tongues. Because identity, especially one drawn from movement and defiance, withers quickly when the conditions that bred it fade. Language diluted too. Old Norse evolved as communities interacted with neighbors, birthing what would become Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. In the diaspora, England, Ireland, Normandy, Norse blended with French, English, and Gaelic tongues until it became something entirely new. A people once unified by speech began to forget the sound of their own sagas. Shadows over glory. By the mid-11th century, the Viking Age's proud energy had turned to reflection. In their poetry, we feel the ache of loss vividly. They spoke of ravens still circling empty battlefields, of men too tired for adventure. The stories grew elegiac, not of what was, but of what had been. The Sagas of Iceland, written a century or two later, would immortalize this pain but also distance it. By then, the Viking had become history, not neighbor but ancestral ghost. Externally, the world closed in. In England, resistance to Norse rule culminated under Harald Godwinson. In 1066, when King Harald Hardrada of Norway sailed to claim his crown, his fleet glittered like the last sunlight of the Viking world. At Stamford Bridge, the English crushed his army. Hardrada fell, one of the greatest warriors of his age, and with him the old Viking dream. 3 weeks later, another invasion, William of Normandy's, succeeded where Hardrada's failed. The irony was complete. The last Viking to conquer England did so not as a pagan raider, but as a Christian duke speaking French. The spirit still afloat. And yet, decline did not mean disappearance. The Norse spirit survived quietly, in seafaring traditions, in poetry, in law. The same independence that once filled their sails continued to shape their societies. Even as kings ruled and priests preached, ordinary people remembered. The songs of the Eddas and the tales of the Volsungs hung on through centuries of retelling. When we look back now, we can sense their stubborn defiance in every artifact, in the carving of a ship's prow, in the rhythm of a saga, in the weathered face of a runestone standing alone in a field as though still listening for distant thunder. The unraveling, then, was less a collapse and more a transformation. The Norse didn't vanish. They changed shape. Their horizons folded inward. Their myths turned to memory, and from that memory, a new northern identity was born. Quieter, perhaps, but no less fierce. There comes a night in every long winter when the fire burns low, and even the bravest must admit that the season has changed. For the Viking world, that night fell in the 11th century. The signs had been gathering for years, shifting faith, tightening crowns, quieter seas. But now, the transformation was undeniable. The age of the Vikings, as the world had known it, was coming to an end. The Longships still cut through the water, but they did so under new banners, for new masters, in a world that no longer feared them as it once had. The very forces that had once given the Norse their strength, mobility, independence, faith in fate, were now reshaped, contained, or turned against them. What had begun as hairline fractures had widened into clear, unbridgeable breaks. A final bid for glory. If there was a single moment people later pointed to and said, "There, that was the end," it was the year 1066 on a mild September day near a quiet river in England. At Stamford Bridge, the legendary Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, a warrior tempered in Byzantine courts and Rus campaigns, led a great army to claim the English throne. His expedition was one last echo of the old Viking audacity, a final attempt to seize fortune by daring and steel. And for a brief moment, it must have felt gloriously familiar. Sails crowding the horizon, shields gleaming, men chanting war songs to Odin and Christ alike. Hardrada's army defeated the English at Fulford, and it seemed as though history might repeat itself. Another northern conqueror, another kingdom bent to Viking will. But the world had changed. King Harald Godwinson, ruling an increasingly unified and organized England, marched his army north with astonishing speed. At Stamford Bridge, he caught Hardrada's forces off guard. The battle was fierce and bloody. The old stories tell of a lone Norse warrior holding the narrow bridge for a time, cutting down dozens before he fell. Yet heroism could not win the day. Hardrada was killed, struck down by an arrow to the throat, and his army shattered. Of the hundreds of ships that had carried his men, only a handful were said to be needed to take the survivors home. That image, empty berths, quiet decks, captures the moment when the Viking age of ruthless expansion finally snapped. Worlds colliding. What made this a true breaking point wasn't just the death of one king, but what followed. Barely 3 weeks after defeating the Norwegians, Harald Godwin's son faced another invader, William, Duke of Normandy. William, himself descended from Norse settlers, no longer called himself a Viking. He was a Christian ruler, armored in feudal law, bringing with him knights, castles, and a new kind of warfare. At Hastings, Harald fell, and England passed into Norman hands. In those few weeks, the old and new Norse worlds collided and diverged. Hardrada represented the fading past, the Sea King seeking his prize with axe and shield wall. William embodied the future, a descendant of Vikings who rode horses, spoke French, and wielded institutions instead of war bands. One perished, the other prevailed. From that point on, the Viking identity as a distinct force in European politics was broken. The North still mattered, but as kingdoms, not raiding cultures. How different people felt the change. The breaking point was not experienced the same way by all. For kings and elites, the shift could feel like promotion. Rulers like Knut the Great had already ruled large, Christianized empires, writing law codes and negotiating with the papacy rather than raiding monasteries. They saw themselves less as chieftains of wild sea warriors and more as peers of emperors. For them, the end of the Viking Age was not loss, it was maturity. For ordinary farmers and freemen, it was quieter and harsher. They watched as taxes rose, as foreign bishops claimed tithes. As kings demanded levies for wars they neither chose nor fully understood. They no longer sailed for silver, they paid it. Some may have felt relief that the days of sudden raids and feuds were fading. Others surely felt something more bitter, as though a flame in their bloodline had been gently smothered. For warriors it was perhaps the hardest. The old path to honor, to take ship, to risk death, to return with fame, narrowed. War didn't vanish, but it changed. Battles became matters of kings and dynasties, fought by professional retainers and mercenaries. A man's worth was less his courage at sea and more his place in a hierarchy. The shield wall gave way to cavalry charges, stone castles, and siege engines. The wild, open style of Viking warfare no longer dominated the field. And for skalds, poets, and storytellers, the end of the age brought an unexpected gift and sorrow time. They began to write the sagas down. Lost resources, lost freedom. The breaking point was also economic and environmental. Far-flung colonies, once symbols of ambition, became burdens. Greenland struggled with climate change, colder winters, shorter growing seasons, and its marginal farms strained to survive. Trade routes shifted or vanished during political upheavals in the east. The flow of silver that had enriched Scandinavia slowed. The world's wealth no longer moved on Viking terms. As European states developed systems of fortifications and standing defenses, opportunistic raiding ceased to be profitable. Coastal towns built stone walls. River mouths were guarded. The days when a handful of ships could terrorize a kingdom were gone. The North had evolved, but so had everyone else. Without the old channels of wealth, the Norse world became more inward-looking. Land, not loot, mattered most. Family alliances, marriages, and local disputes once again became the center of life. There was less room for the archetypal Viking, restless, horizon-bound, eager to carve destiny with an oar and a blade. Attempts to recover. Yet people do not let go of ways of life easily. Even after Stamford Bridge, Scandinavian rulers launched campaigns abroad, Sweyn Estrithson's efforts in England, Magnus Barefoot's ventures in Ireland and the British Isles, like aftershocks of a great quake. These expeditions showed that the instinct for seaborne warfare still flickered. But they were no longer civilization-defining. They were episodes, not eras. Within Scandinavia itself, kings occasionally tried to revive or repurpose the past. They drew on Viking imagery to rally support, invoking ancestors and old gods in political language even as they prayed in churches. Law codes written under Christian kings sometimes included provisions that resembled older customs, a way of reassuring their subjects that not everything had changed. But each attempt to go back collided with an unyielding reality. The structure of the world had shifted. Land was ruled by crowns recognized by the church. Trade was regulated. Wars were orchestrated by dynasties and justified in Christian terms. The Vikings could not simply resume being what they had been, because the stage on which they once moved no longer existed. When old becomes new, So where exactly did the Viking Age end? Some point firmly to 1066 and the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Others note that Norse campaigns continued afterward and argue for a softer, later fade. But in truth, the end was not a date. It was the moment when the behaviors, beliefs, and institutions that had defined Viking life became something else. When Vikings ceased to be a living identity and became a story. By then, Christianity was entrenched in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, with kings like Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason having paved the way generations earlier. The Thing assemblies still existed, but as echoes inside larger monarchies. Runestones still stood, but new burial grounds surrounded churches. The North remained itself in landscape, language, and temperament, but the people walking those lands were no longer Vikings in the old sense. They were Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, subjects, and citizens of emerging medieval states. And so the old becomes new. The Viking Age didn't vanish. It transformed into the foundations of Scandinavia as we know it. The ships were pulled onto land. The warriors' children became farmers and townsfolk. The gods retreated into poetry, and the heroes into books. Yet, if you listen carefully to a northern shore at night, to the hiss of the tide against stone, the cry of seabirds over dark water, you might feel, just for a moment, that the age never fully ended. It simply changed its name. This brings us to the threshold of transformation and memory, when the Viking Age is over, but its people live on in new forms. When a great wave recedes, it leaves behind more than wet sand. Shells, driftwood, fragments of distant shores, quiet traces of its passing. The end of the Viking Age was like that. The longships no longer darkened foreign horizons, and the thunder of raids had faded into story, but the Norse world did not vanish. It lingered, in places, in habits, in memories, reshaped into something quieter yet enduring. Let's sit with that stillness for a moment. The battles are over now. The last major raids have ended. Kings kneel before altars, and churches breathe their bells into the same air once stirred by war horns. The age of sea kings has passed. What is left in the wake? The survivors and their new lives. The survivors of this transition were not just warriors growing old. They were families, farmers, traders, shipbuilders, and storytellers who learned to live in a world where being Viking was no longer a job but a memory. In Scandinavia proper, people carried on much as before, plowing fields, tending herds, fishing cold waters, but under new rhythms. Christianity, firmly rooted by the 12th century, reframed time around church calendars and saints' days instead of pagan feasts. Yet beneath these changes, deeper habits remained. The value placed on personal honor, the communal habit of assembly, the stubborn independence that would shape Nordic societies for centuries. Some of the most visible survivors of the Viking world were the colonists who had sailed west. Iceland, settled largely by Norwegians and their families in the late 9th and 10th centuries, became a kind of living archive of older ways. Its people developed a commonwealth with no king, governed by a national assembly at Yggdrasil, preserving a remarkably detailed legal tradition and a strong sense of individual rights. Further west still, Norse settlers in Greenland clung to the edges of a harsh world. They built farms in sheltered fjords, raised cattle and sheep, and traded ivory and hides. For centuries, their small communities endured, with populations in the low thousands and farms scattered across eastern and western settlements. They built churches like the one at Gerar, even making it an episcopal seat, with a stone cathedral whose ruins can still be traced. These settlers were Vikings by ancestry but medieval farmers by necessity. The dispersal of knowledge and practice. With the closing of the Viking Age, Norse skills did not dissolve, they dispersed. Shipbuilding, for instance, continued to define coastal life. The sleek silhouette of the longships softened into broader cargo vessels. But the core principles, clinker-built planks, shallow drafts, balanced hulls, remained in northern boat-building traditions for centuries. Scandinavian mariners stayed among Europe's finest, their knowledge of currents, winds, and coastal navigation woven into the fabric of everyday trade rather than drama. Legal practices also survived. The tradition of the Thing assemblies, where free men met to debate law, persisted in places like Iceland and parts of Norway, eventually blending into later parliamentary forms. Even as written codes replaced oral recitation, the expectation that law was something discussed, not simply imposed, remained a distinct Scandinavian trait. Socially, concepts like wergild, compensation for injury or death, and an emphasis on mediation rather than pure vengeance entered into Christian law codes and customs, tempering harsher feudal norms with older ideas of balance. The Viking Age had taught the North that communities survived not only through strength, but through structures of compromise. What was preserved, what was lost? Much was lost, of course. The pagan temples, sacred groves, and many oral traditions vanished without record. Archaeology and a handful of written sources hint at the richness of rituals and local myths that no one ever wrote down. Countless stories, prayers, jokes, and songs died with the last generation to live fully in the old faith. The everyday voices of women, thralls, and the poor, those who rarely appeared in sagas, mostly disappeared into silence. Yet, paradoxically, the Christianization that ended the Viking Age also helped preserve it. In Iceland between the 13th and 15th centuries, anonymous authors began to write down the old tales, the Icelandic Sagas and Eddas in Old Norse. These works fixed into ink what had long lived only in memory. Feuds, voyages, love stories, and myths of gods and giants. Collectors like Arni Magnusson would later gather these manuscripts, safeguarding them until modern times, a legacy now recognized by UNESCO. From this effort, the Viking past gained a second life. The sagas became a bridge, carrying the old world into new ages. Through them, even as old practices faded, old values, courage, honor, wit, and fatalistic humor, continued to whisper across centuries. Exiles, adapters, and quiet continuities. In some places, the end of the age created exiles. Individuals who clung fiercely to pagan rites or raiding lifestyles found themselves pushed to the margins. Some fled to Iceland during Norway's Christianization. Others may have sought refuge in remote valleys or joined foreign armies where their skills still had value. Their lives rarely entered official records, but their existence can be sensed in lingering folk beliefs, rural customs, and the stubborn survival of certain names, symbols, and superstitions. Most people, though, did not flee or resist dramatically. They adapted. They went from calling on Thor for protection to whispering prayers to Christ or the Virgin Mary, often still wearing old amulets or carving quiet runes on objects hidden from clerical eyes. For generations, the line between pagan and Christian was blurry, more a gradient than a border. Norse combat skills found new outlets. Many Scandinavians joined foreign forces as mercenaries, particularly the Varangian Guard in Byzantium. There, in distant marble corridors, the last echoes of Viking warrior culture continued under new flags. Men from the north still swore oaths, guarded emperors, and died far from home. Their descendants melted into Mediterranean populations, their stories only partially preserved in chronicles and runic graffiti on foreign stone. Memories that endured. What remained most powerfully were memories, not always accurate but emotionally true. The Norse remembered their settlement of Iceland and Greenland, their voyages west to lands like Vinland, their deeds in Ireland and England. They told and retold these stories until the line blurred between history and legend, a blur that, in some ways, better reflects how they themselves understood the world. In Iceland especially, Viking ancestry became a source of identity, pride, and continuity. The sagas of Icelanders, though written down after the Viking Age, describe events from the 9th to 11th centuries and remain central to Icelandic culture today. They are not simple historical records. They are meditations on honor, fate, and community, the very things that had once bound the Viking world together. By the late Middle Ages, the Viking Age was gone, but its traces were everywhere, in place names across the British Isles and Normandy, in the DNA of populations from Dublin to Kiev, in the ships that still hugged Nordic coasts, in the stories told in long, dark winters when families gathered together and spoke of ancestors who had once followed the stars across black water. What remained, then, was not an empire nor a nation, but a tone of life, an attitude toward risk, fate, and memory carried forward in subtle ways. The waves had withdrawn, but the shoreline was forever changed. When a people step out of history and into memory, their story does not end. It changes medium. Steel and timber give way to words and symbols. The Viking world, once so physical, oars biting water, axes striking shields, began, after its age had passed, to live an afterlife in the minds of others. Tonight, imagine all the coasts the Norse once touched, long after their ships have stopped coming. The shores of England and Ireland, the rivers of Russ, the courts of Normandy, the farms of Iceland. In each of these places, people remembered the Northmen, sometimes with fear, sometimes with admiration, often with both. From these memories, a legacy grew that was far larger than the raiders who first brought it. How others remembered the Vikings. In England, the memory of Viking raids was seared into chronicles and place names. The very map still whispers their presence. Towns ending in by and thorpe, like Grimsby, Whitby, Scunthorpe, marking where Norse settlers once lived among Anglo-Saxons. The Danelaw, that swath of northern and eastern England under Scandinavian control, left a lasting imprint on local law, land organization, and language, weaving Norse customs into English society. Irish and Scottish annals recall the Lochlanach, men from the lakes and fjords, who first came as raiders and later as rulers of towns like Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford. In these regions, Norse blood mixed with Gaelic, creating hybrid cultures whose identities would echo through medieval kingdoms and clans. In Normandy, the very name told the tale. Normans, Northmen, descendants of Viking settlers who had been granted land in northern France in the early 10th century. They soon adopted the French language and Catholic faith, but retained something of their ancestors' aggression and adaptability. From this blend emerged a powerful new people who would conquer England in 1066, carve territories in Italy and the Levant, and leave their mark on law and aristocratic culture across Europe. Further east, among the Slavs, the Norse left an imprint in the early Rus state. Scandinavian warriors and traders helped form ruling dynasties in Novgorod and Kiev, before being culturally absorbed into the Slavic majority and Orthodox Christian tradition. To later chroniclers there, the Scandinavian roots of the Rus faded into a distant prelude, half-remembered but foundational. Everywhere the Vikings had passed, what lingered was not just destruction, but connection. Trade routes, mixed populations, shared words, hybrid laws. Their afterlife began as the echo of encounters in lands that learned to live with, and then alongside, these northern strangers. What was adopted, adapted, reimagined. Pieces of Viking culture quietly anchored themselves in everyday European life. In language, Old Norse contributed words that English speakers still use without thinking: sky, egg, knife, window, law, husband, and even weekday names like Thursday, Thorsday, and Friday, linked to Frigg or Freya. The linguistic footprint of the Norse is a reminder that they did not only raid. They settled, married, and raised children whose tongues blended vocabularies. In law and governance, the Norse custom of open assemblies, the thing, influenced local institutions where they settled. In places under Viking control like the Danelaw, Scandinavian legal concepts mingled with Anglo-Saxon practices, shaping regional law and community decision-making. Even centuries later, the idea that free men should gather to debate and decide remained a point of pride in Nordic countries. In technology, Viking shipbuilding left a deep imprint on maritime history. The clinker-built technique and flat-bottomed hulls influenced later Northern European vessels, including the cogs used by the Hanseatic League. Their mastery of steering oars and sail control became part of the foundation of medieval seafaring. Long after Vikings ceased to be an identity, Northern shipwrights still built in their tradition, enabling new ages of trade and exploration. The Normans, descended from Vikings, carried forward a transformed version of this heritage. Their castles, administrative systems, and fusion of French, Norse, and Anglo-Saxon cultures reshaped England and much of Europe. Through them, Viking aggression and adaptability reappeared in new armor, behind new banners. Mythology's long shadow, perhaps the most powerful afterlife of the Viking Age, lies in its mythology. The Old Norse gods Odin, Thor, Loki, Freya might have lost their worshippers, but not their voices. In Iceland, Christian scribes preserved pagan myths in works like the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda, written down in the 13th century. These texts crystallized a mythic universe: the world tree Yggdrasil, the 9 realms, Ragnarok, and a cosmos where even gods accept their fate. Centuries later, these stories would inspire composers like Wagner, writers like J.R.R. Tolkien, and countless modern authors and filmmakers. Tolkien drew heavily from Norse myth for his elves, dwarves, the idea of a cursed ring, and even the wanderer figure of Gandalf, who echoes Odin traveling the world in disguise. In this way, Norse mythology slipped into the bloodstream of modern fantasy and popular culture, shaping how millions imagine magic, heroism, and doom. Folklore across Scandinavia also carried threads of the old beliefs: trolls in the mountains, huldufolk, hidden people, and tales of enchanted weapons and fated heroes. Even after official religion changed, the landscape remained haunted by the imagination of the Viking Age. The myth of the Viking reinvented. As the centuries rolled on, the Viking afterlife continued to evolve. In the 18th and 19th centuries, during the era of Romantic nationalism, Scandinavians, and Europeans more broadly, rediscovered the sagas and recast the Vikings as heroic ancestors. Painters, poets, and scholars turned them into symbols of courage, freedom, and rugged individuality, often glossing over the brutality and complexity of their real history. This revival gave us many of the images still common today: horned helmets, a 19th century invention, noble warrior heroes, and idealized longships slicing through misty seas. Nations used these figures to build modern identities, proof that their people had once stood tall in the world. The romanticized Viking became a mirror, reflecting whatever a given era needed. For some, a champion of democracy and proto-parliamentary life. For others, a symbol of racial or imperial fantasies. For many, simply a compelling figure of adventure and defiance. This layering of meanings, medieval memory, saga storytelling, romantic reinvention, and modern media, means that the Viking living in today's imagination is not one thing, but a collage, a legacy still unfolding. Today, the Viking afterlife touches everything from city tourism to metal band logos, from TV dramas to academic conferences. Serious historians and archaeologists work to peel away myth and recover the texture of real lives, while popular culture joyfully recombines fact and fantasy. Yet beneath all the exaggerations, something genuine persists. A fascination with how the Norse faced a hard world with boldness and creativity. Their legacy lives in our languages, our laws, our ships, our stories, and in the way we think about facing fate with open eyes. In that sense, the Viking Age never entirely died. It migrated into ink, into imagination, into quiet traces on the land and in the words we speak. Its afterlife is not just about what the Vikings did, but about what later generations chose to remember, forget, and reinvent. The Viking world lay buried, not just in soil and sea, but in silence for centuries after its end. Churches rose over sacred groves, farms over battlefields, and stories hardened into half-remembered sagas. Then, in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, scholars, explorers, and accidental farmers began to dig. What they found reshaped not just history, but how we see ourselves. Tonight, let's walk those excavations, feeling the chill of turned earth and the thrill of voices long quiet. The scholars and excavators. The rediscovery began with manuscripts. In the 17th century, Danish scholar Ole Worm collected Norse texts, but the true breakthrough came with Arne Magnusson, an Icelander who, in the early 1700s, gathered thousands of vellum pages from farms and monasteries across Iceland and Denmark. These contained the sagas, eddas, and law codes, fragile links to the Viking mind. Magnusson's collection, split between Copenhagen and Reykjavik, became the foundation for understanding Old Norse literature, preserved through fires, floods, and wars. Archaeology followed. In 1880, a farmer in Gokstad, Norway, plowed up what turned out to be a 9th century royal ship burial, 23 meters long, complete with carved beasts and iron rivets. 3 years later, the Oseberg ship emerged from a vestfold mound, an ornate 9th century vessel buried with 2 high-status women, their sleighs, tapestries, and even sacrificed animals. a glimpse into elite female lives that shattered old assumptions. These ships, now in Oslo's Viking Ship Museum, revealed the Norse as master craftsmen, not just barbarians. Sweden's Birka, a major trading hub, yielded urban remains. Workshops, harbors, even a possible warrior grave with a woman's skeleton and weapons, debated fiercely ever since. In Denmark, Ribe and Hedeby excavations uncovered bustling markets with Islamic coins and Frankish glass. Iceland's Mosfell Valley blended saga descriptions with digs, confirming farmsteads and chieftain halls from tales like Egil's Saga. Each spade of earth brought texture. Combs, brooches, tools whispering of daily lives. Physical and documentary remnants. The remnants were everywhere and nowhere. Runestones dotted Swedish fields. 3,000+ memorials etched with voyages, deaths, and Thor's hammers, like the gelling stones where Harald Bluetooth boasted of uniting Denmark and converting it to Christ. Hordes of hacked silver Arab dirhams, Frankish deniers, spilled from plowed fields, proving trade networks to Baghdad. Ships dominated. Gokstad's oak longship, Oseberg's carved elegance, Skaldalef's fleet of 5 varied vessels sunk to block a harbor, warships, traders, ferries showing Norse versatility. Graves held surprises. The Birka warrior woman, with arrows, sword, and dice. Her DNA female, stirring debate on shield maidens. Documents were scarcer. Foreign chronicles, Anglo-Saxon chronicle, Frankish annals recorded raids with horror. Norse sources? Mostly post-Viking. Iceland's 13th century sagas blending oral memory with Christian hindsight. Runes on stones and bones offered raw glimpses. Boasts, prayers, even curses. What surprised us? The earth revealed a complexity beyond raids. Vikings weren't just violent. They were traders first, settlers second. Oseberg's luxury, silk imports, carved beds, showed wealth and artistry. Birka's graves hinted at diverse warriors, challenging male-only fighter myths. No horned helmets appeared. That was 19th century opera fantasy. Women emerged vividly. Oseberg's ladies, Birka's possible shield maiden, saga heroines like Gudrid who sailed to Vinland. Daily life felt intimate. Soapstone vessels for cooking, wooden toys, gaming pieces. A world of craft and play. Scale surprised too. DNA shows Norse genes from Ireland to Russia. Place names blanket Britain. They connected Europe, not just terrorized it. How understanding evolved. Early views were biased. Christian chroniclers painted heathens. 19th century romantics idealized noble savages with fake horns. Sagas, once gospel, were reappraised as 13th century blends of fact and fiction. Useful but unreliable for Viking Age details. 20th century archaeology shifted focus. Process over events. Climate data tied raids to Scandinavian famines. Isotope analysis traced migrants' diets and origins. DNA revolutionized, confirming female warriors, mapping diasporas. Today, interdisciplinary work, sagas plus digs, paints nuanced portraits. Pragmatic traders, devout pagans, adaptive settlers. Popular media romanticizes, but scholars emphasize hybridity. Vikings as Europeans among Europeans. What we still debate and don't know. Mysteries persist. Did shield maidens fight routinely, or were they rare? Birka's grave fuels argument. Warrior or symbolic burial? Vinland's scope, how far into America? Leif Erikson's camp at Lance Aux Meadows is confirmed Norse, but no permanent colony. Oral culture leaves gaps. Everyday religion, women's voices, thralls' lives. How violent were they really, raiders or opportunistic traders? Why did Greenland fail? Climate, Inuit conflict, isolation. Runes hint at magic we can't read fully. Shipwrecks hide undiscovered fleets. Were all Vikings Scandinavian, or did others join? The debate sharpens our story, reminding us history is process, not monolith. These finds, ships from mud, words from vellum, rebuilt the Vikings not as myth but people. Flawed, brilliant, human. Their rediscovery keeps the conversation alive, layer by layer. As the fire in our imagined hearth burns low tonight, casting long shadows across these stories of fjords and longships, let's pause. not to summarize dates or kings, but to listen for the quieter echoes, the human truths that rise like smoke from every great history. The Viking tale, for all its drama of sea and steel, speaks to questions as old as our first questions. How do we face what we cannot change? What survives when all else crumbles? What does it mean to leave a mark on a turning world? These northern people, shaped by ice and salt, offer patterns that mirror every civilization and, perhaps, our own restless moment. Their story is not theirs alone. Universal themes of expansion and limit. Every society dreams of horizons. The Norse, hemmed by thin soil and long winters, turned outward with a ferocity born of necessity. Their expansion, from Baltic traders to Atlantic settlers, reminds us how limits breed boldness. Yet every tide ebbs, resources thinned, defenses hardened abroad, and success itself bred complacency at home. This cycle echoes Rome's overstretch, the Mongols' fragmentation, even modern empires straining against their own weight. Expansion tests not just strength, but adaptability. The Vikings thrived by reinventing themselves, raiders into rulers, pagans into pragmatists, until reinvention became erasure. Their lesson: motion sustains until it exhausts. Fate, courage, and the human condition. At the Norse heart lay Wyrd, fate as woven thread, inescapable yet met with defiance. Their gods did not promise victory, only valor. Ragnarok foretold cosmic doom, yet heroes fought anyway. This fatalism without despair speaks to perennial challenges. Plagues, wars, losses we cannot outrun. In our time, facing climate shifts or unseen crises, their ethos resonates. Not blind optimism, but clear-eyed resolve to act nobly amid inevitability. As the Havamal counsels, the lame can ride horse, the handless drive cattle, the deaf one can be a chanter, and the blind is no worse than the blind. Limitation sharpens meaning. Acceptance fuels agency. Women in their world, managing halls while men sailed, embodied this too. Quiet power amid chaos, proving strength lies not in spectacle but endurance. Parallels to other civilizations. The Viking arc parallels others strikingly. Like the Mycenaeans or Hittites, they burst from margins into prominence, then faded into legend, their linear be tablets or Luwian seals waiting for rediscovery. Like the Sea Peoples who shook Bronze Age empires around 1200 BC, Norse raids disrupted without conquering outright, catalysts more than conquerors. Closer to home, their Christianization mirrors Anglo-Saxon or Frankish transitions. Old gods yielding to a universal faith that promised unity but demanded conformity. Yet, unlike rigid Byzantium, Norse flexibility let them absorb and adapt, seeding Norman dynamism or Icelandic democracy. Modern echoes abound. Tech-driven migrations, where digital nomads chase opportunity like Baltic traders, or climate refugees eyeing Greenland's ice melt, wondering if Old Norse farms whisper warnings. Values and practices still relevant. Certain Norse habits endure for good reason. Their thing assemblies, open debate among equals, seated parliamentary traditions from Iceland to the British Isles, a bulwark against tyranny. Honor as reputation, not title, fostered trust without bureaucracy. Craftsmanship, ships as living art, teaches holistic excellence. Beauty serves function. Environmental attunement, reading winds and stars without instruments, models intuitive wisdom over tech dependence. Their poetry's kennings, Whale Road, for sea, Battle Sweat, for blood sharpened perception, turning ordinary into vivid. In a distracted age, such linguistic precision grounds us. Women's economic roles, owning property, divorcing, leading households, challenge stereotypes, proving gender equity can thrive in harsh conditions. Myths, realities, and why it matters. Myth and reality intertwined early. Sagas romanticized feuds. 19th century nationalists added horns. Yet archaeology grounds us. Oseberg's wealth, Birka's diversity. This dance, legend-amplifying fact, shows memory's power. Close your eyes for a moment, if you will, and let the chill of northern mist settle around you once more. Feel the salt wind off the fjords, carrying the faint creak of longships long beached, the low murmur of skalds reciting verses into the endless night. The hearth fire before us has burned low now, just glowing embers casting a warm, ruddy light on timber walls carved with serpents and stars. We've journeyed far together tonight, through the crash of waves at Lindisfarne, the smoky halls of Birka, the fading echoes of Stamford Bridge. The Viking world, in all its fierce beauty and quiet sorrow, has unfolded before us like a saga whispered by the gods themselves. What stays with you from this telling? Perhaps the paradox at its heart. A people who sailed into the unknown not to escape fate, but to embrace it. They taught us that true courage isn't denying the storm. It's lashing yourself to the mast and steering through. Their rise from scattered clans to horizon shapers. Their peak of dragon-proud glory. Their gentle unraveling into kingdoms and churches. These arcs mirror every human endeavor. We expand until we strain, flourish until we forget our roots, transform or fade. Yet through it all, the Norse left something unbreakable. The conviction that a life well-lived echoes beyond the grave, carried on voices and waves. And oh, the enduring mystery of it. How these northern souls, bound by ice and blood, touched every corner of their world and ours. Greenland's vanished farms whisper of hubris and climate's quiet revenge. The saga's tangled truths remind us memory is never pure, always woven with longing. Vinland's fleeting shores tease what might have been. A new world claimed not by steel but curiosity. Their gods may sleep in Asgard's ruins, but Thor's thunder still rolls in our storms, Odin's riddles in our questions. What beauty lingers in that impermanence? Cattle die, kinsmen die, you die, but a story, well told, never does. If this tale has stirred something in you, a pull toward the sea, a reflection on your own horizons, lean into it, dive deeper, seek the Oseberg ship's carved elegance in Oslo's halls, trace runes on gelling stones under Danish skies, walking Valorous Rift where free voices once shaped law. Read the Egil Saga by firelight, or sail Iceland's coasts where settlers first carved freedom from lava. Let their questions become yours. What mark will you leave when the tide pulls back? How will you face your own WYRD? Memory is our truest immortality. Not stone monuments or golden hoards, but the stories we pass like torches in the dark. Loss carves us hollow, yes, but what fills the space? For the Norse it was song, craft, kin. What survives of them survives in us. Words like berserk and thrift, the rhythm of parliamentary debate, the poetry of whale roads and shield walls. They remind us that even endings seed beginnings. Ragnarok births a greener world. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep or simply sit in the hush, honor this shared vigil. Honor the Vikings not as distant legends, but as kin in the human struggle, restless, resilient, alive in defiance. Wherever you are, Bengaluru's warm nights, a fjordside cabin, a city window framing stars, carry their fire a little longer. Let it warm your questions, steady your sails. Thank you for journeying with me through these cold waters and warm halls. If the North calls to you again, its shores are always open. Until next time, rest well, wander boldly, and may your fame never die.